Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's absolutely no question that racial discrimination existed in our country, and in many places, people would argue that it still does. And so we had all kinds of ways to keep black people from voting. We had poll taxes, we had literacy tests, we had, I think some places even required them to count how many jelly beans were in a jar. All kinds of ways to keep black people from voting. This happened. I don't think anybody can deny that that was going on. And as far as I'm concerned, there is a pattern now of voter suppression going on in our country right now. And the Calais decision just plays into that by pretty much gutting the Voting Rights Act, which, by the way, was reaffirmed many times in a bipartisan way in acknowledging that this kind of racial discrimination occurred, and that as a democratic country where everybody has an equal vote, that's not tolerable. But suddenly it's A-OK, just because the Supreme Court says so. No, it's not the entire Supreme Court. It's a 63 majority, which I consider to be basically an out-of-control Supreme Court majority where there is a pattern of this kind of decisions out of this court. So just because this court says so doesn't mean I agree with them. So meanwhile, there is voter suppression going on. You have an attorney general who sued at least 29 states to get these states to turn over their voter rolls. Why? What does the Department of Justice, what does the executive branch want to do with all this voter information? Up to no good, I would say. There's this huge push to pass the SAVE Act. It's more Save Trump Act. And what does that act do? It would require millions and millions, all of us who are registered to vote, suddenly we will have to show proof of citizenship, either through a birth certificate or a passport. Millions of people don't have either. Married people who take their partner's name will not have a name that matches their birth certificate. So what are they going to do? There are going to be millions of people who are not even going to register to vote. And you think Trump doesn't know that? Of course he does. That's why he wants the SAVE Act to be enacted. That's why the Republicans would like to see the SAVE Act enacted, because they know that millions of people will be literally disenfranchised by not even being able to allow to vote. And then with this regime, once you do vote, they will challenge your vote as they did in the last elections. So voter suppression is going on. It's very reminiscent to the kind of stuff that was going on that the Voting Rights Act was intended to address, to fix. And now you have a Supreme Court that says, oh, never mind all of that, never mind all of that history. And over 3 cases, they succeeded in gutting the Voting Rights Act. And don't tell me that the provisions of the Voting Rights Act still exist in a way that is pretty much unenforceable, because the racial gerrymandering is going to be okay unless the legislative body that does the gerrymandering says, oh, by the way, we intend to racially discriminate. Are you crazy? You think that state legislators are going to be that overt about it? Of course not. So you have a Voting Rights Act that you claim is still intact. Please, give me a break. I have a question for Mr. Cox. Last weekend, thousands of people, and apparently you were among them, gathered to protest the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act. The central locations for these protests were Montgomery and Selma, Alabama, and both significant sites in American civil rights history. Mr. Cox, can you put this current moment into historical context for us? For instance, why is this moment reminiscent of when the last Congressman, John Lewis, who many of us consider a friend and hero, led over 600 peaceful protesters across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama?
Thank you, Senator Hirono, for that question. I think it's reminiscent and reflects the fact that the Voting Rights Act was not given to us. It was not bestowed on us. It really came from the people. And the joke I'm sort of making is that Justice O'Connor used to say there were more lawyers in D.C. than people. I think we sometimes feel that way in D.C. We're on the Hill. Lawyers are at the center of the universe, and that's just not true. If we're going to climb out of this destruction of the Voting Rights Act, the penultimate destruction of our democracy, it's going to require the people. And quite frankly, we're being gaslit. We have a Supreme Court, we have allies of the Supreme Court and allies of the Calais case saying discrimination is over. Obviously not true. We have folks on the ground showing and discussing with us that law enforcement are at the polling places. We have folks not only confused, but being discriminated against right now. And I have to say that to to ignore the fact that the people are demanding that Congress respond, that Congress restore the effects test that has been gutted and taken out by Calais would be a mistake. Because folks understand and know what is happening outside in the real world. And they know, particularly black voters know, that they aren't going to return to the 1800s and what we all experienced, or our ancestors experienced, that led us to the Voting Rights Act in the first place.
There is so much more to say, but I fear my time is up.
Thank you.
Thank you.